My name is Hannah Leedle, and I'm a Senior Director of Social Impact at Whiteboard Advisors, and I'm so excited to be here with you today to talk about access to education for incarcerated learners. Research shows that correctional education programs reduce the rate of recidivism by 43% and increase the rate of employment after release by 13%. Yet, the criminal justice system has continuously failed to provide quality instruction to prepare incarcerated people for life after prison. Today, we're going to explore the current state of prison education, why innovations to provide incarcerated learners with access to quality education are so important, and examples of states that are leading the way to make prison education effective for learners and increase opportunities for successful reentry. I'm so excited for you all to hear from the experts that I'm honored to be on stage with today. I'm joined by Abigale Jasinsky, Arti Finn, and Chris Wilson. I'd love to take just a minute at the beginning here for them to introduce themselves before we dive into our discussion. Can I start with you, Abigale?
Sure. My name is Abigale Jasinsky. I am the Deputy Director of Policy for Governor Lee in Tennessee.
I'm Arti Finn. I'm the co-founder and Chief Business Development Officer for APDS. And I like to say I've spent the last 10 years in and out of prisons, hundreds of prisons and jails.
Hello, my name is Chris Wilson. I am a formerly incarcerated individual and also director for engagement for APDS as well as an author and visual artist.
Awesome. Yes. Excellent. I think we can go ahead and just dive right in then. Arti, I'd love to start with you about a question around what prison education looks like across the US. I know you've been working in this space for almost a decade and have no doubt seen an evolution of policies and practices over the years. What does prison education look like in most states and jurisdictions? And more importantly, I guess, do most incarcerated people have access to high quality education?
The answer to the second question is absolutely not. I think the statistics that I like to share with folks is 95% of the people who are incarcerated in this country are getting out. We have 2.2 million people incarcerated. And in our experience, less than 25% of the folks who are incarcerated get access to any type of education, let alone high quality education. When you think of prison or jail education today, you should think about one-room schoolhouses, where if you're lucky enough to get into one, you have no idea what's going to happen when you're in there, and your personal needs are most likely not going to be met.
So it's clear that there's a need for states to kind of be rethinking what it means to support incarcerated learners. And Abigale, I know that you and your team in Tennessee have been doing a lot in this area in recent years, and I'd love to just hear about some of the innovative approaches that you all have been taking toward prison education.
Sure. So it's always exciting for me to hear kind of how little other states have and to see how far we've come came into office in 2019, and the first thing I did was build a statewide college system in our prisons. So that was kind of our first tasking. The first 90 days in office, we did something that no state has ever done before. And since then, we've kept doing it. So we've kind of taken a four-prong approach to education in our system. Tennessee has a kind of a bifurcated system between prisons and jails. We don't oversee the jails, but we do oversee and run the prisons. So within every prison in the state, we've done two things. We've doubled down on adult basic education access so that we didn't have choke points to post-secondary education. And then we've built out a statewide, fully transferable and accredited college system where everybody in a Tennessee prison has access to an associate's degree program or a vocational training program through one of our TCATs or community colleges at no cost. We have nonprofit partners that provide bachelor's, master's, and PhD level education. And we also have industry certified credentials that are available as well, out kind of in that tier just below kind of the traditional post-secondary space. Once we did that, we knew that we also needed to address the folks in our jails, and so we've built out a statewide system of learning in the jails. We started with seed grants to build infrastructure, and now we are actually working in partnership with APDS to do a statewide remote learning module so that everyone in our jails will have access to that same high quality programming. And then we wanted to make sure that the rubber could actually meet the road. So the fourth prong of this approach has been building out an Office of Reentry Services at our Department of Labor and Workforce Development. We've also partnered with American Job Center, so every prison in our state has an American Job Center. And from the day you were kind of entering incarceration in the state of Tennessee, you were being assessed for what your aptitudes and wants are. You're being placed in an education pathway that will allow you to go as far as you want to go at the time you have to go there. There's no cost, there's no barrier to entry that would be kind of a financial burden to folks. We've really doubled down in the systems and the partners to make sure that all of the pieces are in place to allow access. But I think we're fully on our way to achieving Governor's goal of everyone who's incarcerated in Tennessee leaving with at least a high school credential.
That's exciting, and especially I'm from Nashville originally, so as a Nashville native, it makes me very excited and proud to hear
It's pretty cool.
about those innovations. Yeah. I guess one quick follow-up, what was the impetus for those innovations? Like what drove your office to make these decisions and make these changes?
Yeah, so for us it was kind of a no-brainer. Anyone who knows Governor Lee knows his passion for education and access to high-quality education, as well as for kind of transforming our criminal justice system and improving reentry outcomes. He's a kind of a limited government thinker and is very big in public-private partnership and understanding what the purpose of government is. And the purpose of government is and always has been to provide access to education and high-quality education and to provide for public safety. And so we knew when we were looking at recidivism rates in the state and when we were looking at the demographics of the populations that we were seeing increase in our incarceration trends, the access to high-quality education was absolutely something that we needed to do more of. So for us, it's a public safety argument first and foremost. If we're going to spend the money that we spend to incarcerate individuals, we owe it to ourselves and to them to do everything we can do to make sure that they're prepared for success upon reentry. And so I think we've really kind of done that along the way. But yeah, it's just kind of in our DNA as an administration.
No, that's awesome. And Arti, I saw you nodding, and I know you and Chris have spent a lot of time working on these issues with states. Does that resonate? Is that kind of what you're seeing as well?
Honestly, Tennessee is a little bit of a unicorn. You don't really see, and it's so key, I can't emphasize this enough, having leadership at the top is how criminal justice system changes in this country. And Chris can talk to you from his personal experience because he did it all himself. And that's one person fighting an entire system. I mean, we've seen pockets, the DC jails do a fantastic job, State of Maryland does a great job, but there you also see something unique. Department of Labor is involved, and that's key because at the end of the day, we want people to have, 60% of the folks coming out don't have jobs, and they certainly don't have high quality jobs. And so for us to be able to create a system where folks can get living wage employment is so key.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually a good segue because I know obviously, Chris, education has played a really important role in your life and in particular while you were incarcerated. So would love to hear a little bit more just about your story and kind of why high quality education is so important.
So I grew up in Washington, D.C. back in the 80s, early 90s. It was a very violent neighborhood at the time. And unfortunately, there was an incident where my mom and I were attacked by a police officer. And this police officer, when he got out, he lost his job. Started stalking our family and, picking my family members off one by one. And one night, men came after me, and at this point, I was carrying a weapon for protection, and I ended up taking a person's life. And this happened in the state of Maryland, close by the D.C. line, and I was sentenced to natural life in prison. I was 17 years old. And I remember the feeling being in prison and just, 118 pounds, no mustache on my face, and it's like, how is my life over? How can they just throw me away? And I knew in my heart I was a good person, and I was always a secret nerd. I was genuinely curious about, education. I used to love to read books. I still love to read books. And I said, this was when I came up with this idea that I would prove that my life was redeemable through education. And so I wrote up this bucket list. I call it my master plan of how I would prove that my life was redeemable and what I would do when I was free. And so high school diploma, all the vocational shops, read every book that I can find, ended up going to college and getting a degree in sociology and just created my own programs, taught myself to read and write and speak in Spanish, Italian, went on to study Mandarin, but I was stuck in prison. Because of the politics in the state of Maryland, if you get a life sentence, you usually grow old and you die in prison. And I just kept thinking about what I would do if I had a second chance to get out. And I would go up for review every year, and I would tell the review board about, I just learned this, so I'm up to 800 characters in Mandarin, I'm doing all this, and they didn't really believe me. And even when I completed all the modules inside of the prison, I would go back to my cell, and I would study, and I would say, I'm ready for society, and it says, go back to your cell, go back to your housing unit. And so I ended up spending 16 and a half years in prison. I was able to get a second chance finally, and the judge, who I would write every year, says, you put down all these educational goals, and you want to write a book one day, and you want to go back to college, and you want to go back into communities and start companies, you have to do everything on this list. And so I've been home now for 10 years. I've started several companies that provided job opportunities for people who needed help the most. Specifically, 281 people in Baltimore City I helped get jobs. Won every award in the state of Maryland, including the Presidential Award from Obama. Published my book, The Master Plan. And something inside of me, when my life started becoming really well, is that I wasn't close enough to the issues that I cared about. And I had found out about APDS, and I knew how I was able to gain my freedom was through education and therapy. That's what changed me as a person. And I really respected the work that they were doing. They wasn't charging individuals or their families for the programming on these tablets. And so I wanted to work alongside APDS because I feel like that is the key to ending the revolving door of corrections and people going back to prison. And so.
It's always such a powerful story. I was going to say, I hear some applause in the audience for the amazing, amazing work that you've done. And I know as a social entrepreneur, as an advocate, you've put a ton of thought into what prison education kind of could and should look like in an ideal world. And would love to hear just like, what are some of those key characteristics? What are some of those key things that make for effective prison education?
So I think we all agree on this. Your rehabilitation or your reentry plan should start as soon as you get into prison. So around this time, about a year into prison, I was thinking about who would I be at the age of 40? I knew I wanted to be an entrepreneur. What do I need to start studying now? And therapy modules and creating some type of plan, a real plan of like real content that will carry weight once you return to society. So I think things like that are very important. Specific job training skills, accreditation, and just start planning for your return. To Arti's point, 95% of people that are incarcerated, they come back home, and we want them to be better when they get out.
It's really important, especially from an employer point of view, we need to treat the whole human. You cannot expect somebody who's had the trauma of incarceration to come out. And so we really have to provide, and APDS, I think, does this well, this individualized approach where it's about what Chris needs, it's about what Abigale needs, it's about what I need, and then it's taking that and saying, okay, here are the categories that you need to really be involved in. Education, rehabilitation, job training, and reentry. And what is your individualized plan for that? I think something that Tennessee does really well is take that approach and then scale it, which is never easy.
Also, to add to that briefly, I think as employers would appreciate that information of someone being incarcerated, and you can see they've been working for years on this work, and will be more willing to give someone an opportunity to work.
Yeah. So can I just add one thing to that? On the transcript side, so APDS has a transcript that we make available for every individual. So you can actually see as an employer what that person has invested in and what the outcomes they're achieving are. That's really, in some ways, more important than a traditional resume.
One thing I think from the employer engagement side and really kind of making sure that we have a receiving workforce that's ready to kind of step up to the plate and employ these folks is also taking a holistic look at kind of collateral consequences and systemic barriers in state policy. So that's something that we did in an item of legislation we passed. We increased liability for employers who hired someone with a criminal record. There are legislative levers that can be pulled to help kind of put a hand on the back of employers who might be skeptical, but when you look at labor stats these days, I mean, it's, we refer to the folks in our system as our once and future workforce. We've got thousands of people that need jobs and are often required as conditions of their supervision to have jobs. And we've got small businesses that are closing at historic rates because they can't find workers. And so I think navigating that landscape is key. but also making sure that you're putting the right people in front of the employers to build those relationships. Our director of our Reentry Programming office at the Department of Labor is a formerly incarcerated individual that has more than one master's degree. And if you sat down with him as an employer, you would not guess, as many people kind of, do have real preconceived notions in their head of what a formerly incarcerated individual might look like. I think, Chris, when you get out and talk about what you've done, it opens people's minds to the fact that these are neighbors, and they're going to live on your street, they're going to work in your community, they're going to be the person across from you in a business you walk into. They are not the boogeyman. The boogeymen stay in. And I think that that's the thing that people forget. And so it's building those relationships. And we've been really intentional in building out nonprofit partnerships with folks who have also done time and gone on to be extremely successful entrepreneurs, just to kind of break the ice and break the stigma. And it's one of my favorite gotcha moments of all time is when somebody's sitting down and they're really kind of vibing on a conversation, and they're like, oh, by the way, I spent 25 years in a prison. And they're like, what? And from there you can go anywhere. When you kind of break that barrier, then I've seen just a tremendous upside in those relationships. And so I think that's something just to kind of be intentional about as well.
I just want to add one thing. You got to practice what you preach. Tennessee does, APDS does. 15% of our workforce is formerly incarcerated. And, employers say, well, how do you know if that person's going to be a good employee? And for us, the question it's about honesty. Stuff's going to show up in your background search. Everybody does background searches. As long as you're honest about what we're going to find, we don't care.
Absolutely. And just to keep this thread going a little bit longer, I hear talking about scale and personalization and data analysis and sharing. That makes me think, what role does technology play in all of this? Any of you feel free to jump in on that one.
Okay, I got to start. So APDS started, we developed technology back in 2013 when there was no such thing as technology in prisons. We have secure devices that are about 10 inches that anyone who's incarcerated can have access to. The jurisdiction pays. And what it allows is for quality content to be delivered at scale. But we also know technology alone doesn't change outcomes. So states like Tennessee are really important because we partner with teachers. We partner with program officers. And we actually develop a full-scale implementation of an individualized approach, which when you're limited by classroom space and you're separated by barriers, it's really the only way to get folks together. And then you marry that with a tool like a virtual classroom, which I think when I say that, people go, what? You have virtual classroom inside prisons and jails? And the answer is yes, and it works.
To kind of continue on that, we've got virtual classrooms, and we have school buildings. Like, you can walk in, it's like a TCAT. Those are our Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technologies, and you walk in a classroom, and you have exactly what exists in the free world. So that's kind of a really cool thing to have. The data piece from the state perspective is extremely important in a number of ways. I think from a quality control perspective, we need to know that what we're spending taxpayer dollars on works. We also have been able to borrow tremendously from existing practices. So one thing we didn't do, and a lot of people say, like, how on earth did you do this, is we didn't reinvent a wheel. We borrowed from existing college systems. We partnered with our college systems. We partnered with our Department of Workforce Development. We partnered with companies that have been doing this for a really long time. And so we weren't having to create anything new. We were just doing what we already knew worked elsewhere and bringing it inside the walls. And so I think when you're able to do that, you're able to borrow from kind of that longitudinal learning and be able to say, like, this works this way in the free world, it works this way on the inside. And you can kind of measure those quality control measures. But I think that the data piece is always an obstacle for us. It's something that we're continuously seeking to improve. But it's something that, if anybody has kind of an itching in the back of their brain about how they can get involved in this space and they're really into ed tech and data, like, please do it. We need more of that. It really is, I think, the biggest obstacle we have, truly.
And I think that's a good segue. So we know ideally prison education is collaborative and it is personalized and it's scalable. So in addition to that data piece that you were just speaking about, what are some of the other big barriers to implementing high quality, effective programs in this space?
You want me to start?
Go for it.
I think some of the big barriers are honestly attitudes. A lot of jurisdictions, first of all, we have to understand that departments of corrections people who end up involved in the criminal justice system are there because every other state or local agency has failed them. And we expect our Department of Corrections to be this place that is actually going to be transformative. Well, if you've ever been inside a prison or a jail, with some notable exceptions, they don't look like that, right? I've been in one jail in this country, the Montgomery County, Maryland jails, and it looks like a high-functioning high school until you actually get inside, and then you see sort of some of the differences. But the fact that they have a library. So I think the point I'm trying to make is it's really about who's running the system, how innovative are they willing to be, and frankly, how much are they willing to take security breaches as an okay thing.
Yeah, and I think to pile on that, your last point, I think is where I would start, is you have to meet people where they're at and respect where they live in the stakeholder continuum. If you come in and you're like, we're going to do this differently because I said so, just trust me, you're never going to start that project. It will not get off the ground. And so one of the things that we were really intentional about doing is kind of building relationship and honoring the space and the function that our Department of Corrections serves insofar as they have legitimate security concerns. In the best interest of the people who are incarcerated there, by the way. We need to be able to make sure that if someone needs to transfer facilities or not be in a space at a time one day, that they can be that way and it doesn't pull them out of a program. Because too often, I think if you just ignore that reality, you're going to end up where you've got one program somewhere and a different one somewhere else, and if somebody gets transferred, they're the loser there. And so when we held space for the reality of incarceration and built a system around that, every program in our state's fully transferable. If you need to be moved from one facility to another, or you're released from a facility into a receiving community the next day, it's a one-to-one transfer. Wherever you are, you can sit down in another classroom the next day and you're in the same place with the same credits. It's a fully integrated system. There's statewide MOUs. And that's, I think, key to success on the student side, but also success on the relationship side. And it was just sitting down and, asking, we had an extraordinary former commissioner. He just retired after many, many years of great service, but he was a great partner, and that helped a ton. I know other states don't have that same willingness, but I hope that we can kind of be a proof of concept, and we've definitely had states reaching out kind of asking how we did this, because we've not had any real bad outcomes. And, nothing bad has happened from bringing education into our facilities. If anything, really good things have happened. But it really is. I think it's building the relationships. It's honoring the reality that security is the primary concern of the department, and building a system that works with that instead of trying to fight it. And I think we honestly have built a better system for it.
I just want to add, the best security in any correctional facility is a high quality education. And any jurisdiction we work with has said to us, our behavior incidences have gone way down. And it's because people's minds are engaged, right? I mean, Chris, you can speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, Arti, when you said it's about attitude. One of the things I would hear often when I was in prison is, you all should be punished, and our job is to protect the public. And I said, well, it's corrections, and you guys aren't actually correcting anything, right? And just now, as a taxpaying citizen, just imagine someone breaks into your car and takes your radio or something, and they have to do some time. Okay, the loss of freedom is the punishment, but what should they be doing while incarcerated, right? They should be programming, they should be thinking about, instead of breaking into cars, how about you work on cars? But as we know, a lot of prisons and jails don't have quality programming, and so what happens to this person? They become worse. Maybe they get out and they break into your house afterwards. And so as taxpaying citizens, we're paying for the incarceration anyway. Why not get a better return on our taxpayer dollars by individuals incarcerated having access to real programming? It just makes sense to me.
Absolutely. And I actually want to turn to one of the questions that we have from the audience, because I think it's really tied into a lot of what we've been talking about here, in particular on that data side, returning to that point. The question is, how do you know that the education offered in prisons is high quality? Does that resonate with any of you all? What are the things that I guess people are looking for as indicators of like, this is working, or this is a high quality education program?
Well, I could start by saying, well, I thought about this, and I started with vocational training, working with my hands. I thought about earning a college degree. I knew that I could increase my earning potential when getting a job, and I put a lot of focus in studying business because I knew I wanted to start my business one day. So those were like realistic goals that I thought I could achieve, and so I would look for education in prison that would help me prepare for that end game.
Yeah, and then kind of from the qualitative side of it, we hold our, as I've mentioned, the programs that we have inside of our prisons and jails are exactly the same as the programs that we have in our communities. So we hold those partners to the same standards we do any of our other kind of state-funded partners. That we are a outcomes-funded state. We are very, very data-driven in our ethos. We have an Office of Evidence and Impact in our Department of Finance and Administration. We check ourselves constantly on outcomes. So there's certainly the human side of it, and the education needs to be meaningful and relevant to the individuals. Obviously, if we're teaching everybody basket weaving, that's probably not going to do anyone any good. No offense to the artists out there, but like probably not the skill they need to succeed. So it's also making sure that we are matching up our programs to what the labor force is indicating as needs, making sure that we're not credentialing people in something that they'd have some sort of legal barrier to employment in. Constantly doing surveys, going in and sitting down with folks and saying, what do you want to do? What skills do you want that you're lacking? And making sure that we're kind of putting those sorts of programming in so that you've got genuine buy-in and participation, because, certainly apathy can bias your outcomes very easily. But it's really kind of just using best practices from the free world and not trying to treat things exceptionally because they're done on the inside. We've got nonprofit partners. We've been grant funded by Lumina and other national level organizations to do quality control standards. At this point, we're actually developing toolkits on quality control standards and metrics for different organizations. But it's been from day one. I have a master's degree in education policy, so that was something that lives in the back of my head anyway. But from day one, that was just part of the DNA of how we built the program.
I just want to add to that. I think you said something really important, standards. I mean, you really want to work with folks who understand how to deliver quality education in. Most of the states are doing it now with the Pell side of things. On the post-secondary side, I think there's less quality when you start on the adult basic ed through high school equivalency side of things. So I'd like to see us as a nation move more towards a standards-based approach. And Tennessee did something smart. They actually looked at all of the programs that they were offering, at least through us, and they had each one qualified. So any jail that works in the state of Tennessee, they know which program's going in, and the state knows that it's a quality program. So I think that was very clever.
Absolutely.
We actually don't fund anything that's not been certified as evidence-based. We use Pew Clearinghouse and others, but we actually don't allocate state dollars to programs that aren't kind of assessed and credentialed as evidence-based.
Awesome. So there are clear ways that you can say this is high quality, this is not so much. Awesome. I'd love to keep going with a couple more questions from the audience. One is, do you have supports in place for people with mental and physical disabilities? And what about for juvenile systems? I think that's probably both an APDS and a state of Tennessee question.
Yeah, so I'll start. We went into I think people have seen the statistics, but if not, anywhere from 50 to 80% of the folks who are incarcerated have some sort of mental disability. We work with our jurisdictions to actually set up both programs that deal with that, so high quality mental health programs. Substance abuse is a huge issue, which we also support. And then sort of the basis of any mental health program in correctional facilities is cognitive behavioral therapy. All of those are offered to everyone using our devices. And then on the physical disability side, we've got specific, so for example, we have a subset of devices in the state of Utah for folks in the prison system who are hearing impaired. And there they have access to live translation 24/7. So it's really dependent upon the individual and their needs. But I think every jurisdiction should take the approach that they know that there's mental health issues and they need to address those immediately.
I think that everything you said is exactly right, per usual, Arti. I think beyond doing the assessment it's just a reality of the population that we have. And so when we kind of talk about building a system that meets their needs, you're exactly right. There's true access things, there's assessment components. It's meeting individuals where they're at. That's where we start from day one, is understanding what the needs are. We use a really robust assessment tool for risk and needs assessment that'll identify kind of programmatic supports that are needed. One of the things kind of from like IEP world that's not really an IEP in the adult learning space is we kind of assume that everyone needs one, unless for whatever reason they've tested out of that or they've come in with some sort of education. But you don't have to raise your hand to ask for help in our facilities. All of our college programs start with a 6-month onboarding, kind of like a summer study sort of on-ramp, because we wanted to make sure that people were prepared to re-enter that level of educational programming after what could have been, decades of disengagement from higher ed, or never having even completed high school and now getting kind of a GED or a high set in our facilities and moving on. But we do a lot of individualized learning plans, and I think that that's key to meeting people where they're at. If they've got a substance use issue, a mental health, a behavioral health challenge, just kind of giving them the right opportunity for where they are, I think is very, very key. If you only want to pick the best of the best and good luck to you, you're completely missing the boat, in our opinion.
I'd like to add to that. When I went to prison, it was mandatory for us to go to therapy. So I did about 2 to 3 therapy sessions a week. And as a young person who grew up in a very violent neighborhood and lost 5 of my friends before the age of 17, and when I started opening up in therapy, I realized that almost everyone in my therapy group had went through similar traumatic experiences. And 16 and a half years later, when I came home, people would ask, well, what is the most challenging thing for reentry for you, or for most people? And it's finding a job is a challenge, or finding a place to stay, but having emotional support. And even, just talking about therapy is important. Doesn't mean I still go to therapy once a week now too. Doesn't mean that you're broken. It's just better equipping yourself with understanding yourself and understanding the world. And I think it's so important, the mental health aspect of prisons. And especially with juveniles too. Like I wasn't able to process these things that happen, watching my mom be attacked in front of me, or watching my friend die. And in my community, they would just say, just get over it. That's how life is. Just go to school. But I couldn't focus. I couldn't. It was so important for me to unpack what I had witnessed.
We neglect. Sorry, you said juveniles and it triggered. Yep. That was the second part of that question. So we did, this year is the first year. We're going into the 4th year of the Governor's Correctional Education Investment. It's kind of what we call our statewide initiative. And we've proposed or requested money in the budget this year to actually move into our most secure juvenile detention facility for the first time. Obviously, it's a much more challenging environment in some ways, if y'all are familiar with juvenile facilities. And we wanted to make sure we had really solid kind of ground to stand on. But we're really excited now. We're bringing in more high school supports. Obviously, that was something that was needed, but associate's degree programming and vocational training programming. We're doing an associate's degree in business entrepreneurship, because we know we've got some really creative, promising young minds there. We've got really great partnerships in West Tennessee with FedEx and Ford and others that are these kind of huge international corporations that are coming in and willing to engage in this space. And then also some vocational training programs that were reflective of feedback that their student council actually requested when we did a focus group with them. So,
I just want to add on the juvenile point. I think if you don't know, actually all juvenile facilities in this country are mandated to provide between 5 and 8 hours of programs a day. They have specialists. And when you have a controlled environment like that, great things can happen. I mean, we've seen some of our work in juvenile facilities. We saw within 9 months of our program use, folks improve their reading levels by three grade levels.
That's huge.
That's huge. You don't see that in a regular high school.
Can I say something about reading levels? Because literacy is so near and dear to my heart. One of the things that was most shocking to me, but also most exciting to me when we started this work, is we did a survey, because we kind of turned to the Department of Correction and we're like, we need to understand who it is we're trying to teach and what their needs are. And so they did a reading level survey, and the average so for the cohort of individuals in our facilities that does not already have a post-secondary credential, the average reading level for men was 3rd grade, and the average reading level for women was 5th grade. And so when you kind of hold everything we know atmospherically to be true and what it's like to teach and learn in this environment, and understanding where people are starting from, it's the opportunity of a lifetime, honestly. I think when you look at the road that is in front of these individuals and the opportunity and the potential that they have to say, like, and honestly, I don't even care how you got there. It's one of those things where it's like, we need to understand how you got here, but it really doesn't matter because you're here now, and all that matters from this point forward is where you go. But when you've got the opportunity in what's essentially kind of like a boarding school in some ways, when we talk about, mandated programming hours and captive audience, and literally a captive audience, but the ability to capture their attention and their potential, you can change the world for those folks. And that's why I think it's really cool to have the partnerships that we have and the experiences that we've had to be able to really kind of lean into that, because it's a game changer in a way that, most people will never have. If you're a 3rd grade reading level or 5th grade reading level and you're an adult in the free world, you will never have the resources brought to bear that we've been able to create. That's only available, via partnership. But it's just, I think it's exciting. I think it's exciting to center in that again.
Well, I think you might be the only state I've ever heard of that has surveyed their correctional population to actually find that information out. But that 3rd grade it's not unique to Tennessee. We see it all over the country.
It's how we build prisons.
Yeah. It's why we build prisons, honestly. I think one of our investors once said to me, one of the reasons I love you, why the things you guys are doing is because you deal with the folks our K-12 system has failed.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm seeing a couple questions about, like, what does the teaching and learning actually look like, which I think is really interesting. Folks are curious, like, are there live teachers who are teaching in person? Are people teaching virtually? What does recruiting these teachers look like? And I think we actually have someone who's watching virtually who said that he or she works in this environment, which is really interesting to think about from that workforce perspective of who is teaching. And I think you can extend that to who's conducting the CBT sessions, who's working on the social emotional learning sessions. So what does that piece look like?
It looks like a one-room schoolhouse, as I mentioned. You have somebody teaching 8th grade math, for example, and you have students in there who understand and get it quickly, and you have students who are who take more time and need more, and that's why technology is so important, because if Chris is super advanced and I need some more help, I can deal with that with a piece of technology. When schools function well, that's what happens. When they don't function well, which is unfortunately what happens, it needs to be said, most folks don't get the opportunity to go into classrooms because they're just not available. They're used for other reasons. They've been in COVID lockdown for the last 2 years. When they get in, that's the kind of experience they have. But education is so varied and it's so dependent. One of the things you said that I meant to say earlier was your education in a correctional facility depends on where you're incarcerated, for the most part in this country. If I happen to need a high school equivalency and that's not offered in my correctional facility, I don't get it. You can also be transferred. I have a guy who works with me who told me he was incarcerated in a Nebraska prison, and he said, I was a minimum security incarcerated person, and I got transferred to a maximum security facility because that's where the programs that they thought I needed were. And then I waited for 2 years.
Wow.
That is really scary. That's not, we are a country in the first world, and that's how we do our education in this country. That's scary.
Yeah, I mean, format-wise in Tennessee, obviously Tennessee is one state out of many, but we have both, so it depends. The jails, very much the example you gave, there's typically 1 or 2 classrooms that are offering, 1 or 2 programs at a time. They can do that all day, but there's a lot of volunteer MOU sort of partnerships that partner to bring in the live instruction. That's something that we have attempted to scale via some grants. The virtual education component, I think, is where our highest potential is in our jail facilities because they're smaller. We've got 95 counties in Tennessee, which is a really high number for a state, I've learned. But it's difficult to do full, robust school sort of work in a jail versus our prisons. Our prisons do have both as well. We were able to continue offering programming during COVID because of that kind of hybrid capacity, which I think was really important. But we've got full education buildings on our prison campuses where you walk in and it's, a center hallway, it looks just like a high school. You've got a workshop for one thing on another and a computer lab on another, a library. It's a real world school sort of situation. So it's a mixed bag. I've worked in criminal justice policy in other states, and I can say in the 12 states I've been in, it really is the same way. As some facilities have, really extraordinary programming in place. Others don't. There is a very, very real urban-rural divide, and I think the capacity to get, high-quality people into those facilities in kind of peri-suburban and rural areas. But it's getting better, and I think it's, in part due to organizations like yours and thought leadership like yours. But there's the silver lining, I think, of COVID is learning how to live in a more virtual world, and I think that's going to revolutionize the way we're able to do education.
Amen.
Chris, is there anything you would add?
I wouldn't add to that. I saw a question that I wanted to address. Someone asked a question about the importance of instructors or teachers who are racially represent the population of students that they serve. And that's really, really important. I mean, it triggered like an old memory. When I was young, I would, someone's phone's going off. I would remember older folks and even counselors would tell us, you could be anything you want in life, a lawyer or an entrepreneur, you can have your own business, and then they would walk away. And we would sit there and think well, I don't know anyone who looks like me, who came from where I come from, who's done it. And then fast forward, I remember experiences in school, particular teachers who grew up in the same neighborhoods and knew the problems and challenges that we brought to school with us. They would teach us differently. And I would believe them. I would say, I see that you've done it. And that's why myself, being a returning citizen, is so important to go back into the prisons. It's so important to share my story because I need our returning citizens to know that success is possible. And it's just important for us to highlight that.
You should highlight your master plan on our devices.
Absolutely. So one of the things we created on APDS tablet was I turned my book into a master plan course. And so it's some videos integrated with some software technology where, let's imagine a person is locked up in prison with a 40-year sentence, and we'll have a unit in there that's titled Rock Bottom. Okay, this is your rock bottom. You got 40 years ahead of you. Let's unpack this. And, think about what you want to do with your life, and let's walk you through unit by unit, writing down your goals and curated TED Talks that you can, and reading lists, all these things. And it's been incredibly popular. We've been going into Rikers Island almost monthly now and meeting the graduates of these programs. And it's so exciting when I go and I meet these individuals and they say, I'm the next Chris Wilson and I'm going to do it better than you when I get out. And here's my plan and check out my master plan. And I just feel so excited to instill that type of confidence and hope in the people. And it is possible. You got to put in the work, but it is possible. But it's important for them to see someone who's been through what they've been through and has returned home and is doing it.
I'll add on to that if I can, sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Just one way that we've kind of sought to address that is Governor got involved in kind of the criminal justice reform world via mentorship. He was a mentor to an incarcerated individual and cares so much about that and saw the value there. Still has a relationship with that gentleman. He's been to bill signings with us. I've met his children. It's a really special kind of continuum that's long after his release is continued. But one thing that we've really sought to do is build out a mentorship program that couples with our education programs, because the reality of the workforce that's available to us in Tennessee is one where it would be impossible probably to get, and certainly we won't stop striving for it. But if we were going to say we're not going to do this until, we'd be waiting a really long time. It's just going to be difficult to get that level of kind of one-to-one representation. But we're really intentionally trying to balance that out with mentorship. So we do kind of a smart matching sort of mentorship. You're not just getting the next person in the queue as your mentor. But there's a lot of business partnership and entrepreneurship partnership there. So it's outside of the educational umbrella a little bit. But when we start talking about, life skills and reentry and entrepreneurship and what do you do after, life after the classroom and life outside the walls, that's an opportunity that we've really leaned into that I hopeful will help us kind of assuage some of those concerns or bridge that divide a little bit.
And I think Abigale and Chris, what you both just said really underscores, I think, the importance of having that kind of high quality content with your master plan being available, Chris, because we know there are teacher shortages in traditional pre-K through 12, let alone in correctional settings, which I imagine it extends to. And so being able to provide that kind of relevant content while we continue to work to build a strong pipeline of educators, I think is particularly important.
Honestly, it allows people to take agency over their own lives in a way that they don't have when they're incarcerated. And so I think Chris showing a roadmap to folks, and honestly, we hear all the time from folks who are incarcerated that they spend the first 10 days, 30 days, 2 years being shocked. Incarceration is not a great place to be. And so to have somebody have videos of Chris and show there's another way to handle this is, I think, super important. And that personal agency, I can't emphasize enough, because you don't interact with programming if you don't have a personal plan.
And I think, too, you're not going to interact with it if it isn't relevant to your life and to what you want to be doing. And I think that plays into another question I see around, where does civics education enter into incarcerated individuals' current learning opportunities? Is there anything you can speak to around that?
I think post-secondary institutions actually do a pretty good job of that. Unfortunately, less than 20% of the folks who are incarcerated actually get into real post-secondary. But the institutions, like, for example, in the DC jails, they have, I think, on average, 1,500 people incarcerated. They have 11 or 12 colleges operating, including Georgetown, Princeton, really high quality. And they offer, to Abigale's point, that baseline so that everybody who's coming into the program, when they're actually doing the credit-bearing courses, are ready for that.
To add to that, when I was in college, I was studying community studies and civic engagement, and I remember studying the civil rights movement, and I remember how I felt. I developed a new sense of pride. It was also a little disappointment in myself of being incarcerated when, people, were advocating for policy and protesting and doing all these things, important things in America. And I felt a sense of wanting to contribute to it when I got out and just learn about government, learn about how things work. I mean, people can complain about stuff, till they're blue in the face, but you can learn through civic engagement and studying it, like how to address systems, how to change systems. The importance of voting, for example, is like incredibly important. Which 2016, I voted for the first time in my life after we protested for 2 years to overturn the governor in the state of Maryland. And so stuff like that is very important, because it also, when I wasn't able to vote, I had to pay taxes. I was confused, like, well, I want to be a real citizen. And so, like, that's something that we should be teaching and studying. It helps you become a productive citizen.
Absolutely. I see another question here. Do you work with schools in the free world to reduce the school to prison pipeline? I know, Abigale, you've talked a lot about the collaboration amongst different agencies in Tennessee. I don't know if that piece of working with the Department of Education or others has come up at all.
So we actually just rolled out, time is a weird thing for me right now, maybe 2 weeks ago, a whole new funding formula for K-12 education in the state that's weighted differently based on individualized student needs. So it's a student-centered funding formula that I think very much has at the heart of it that, high school completion and student success is the best investment in prevention from incarceration and improvement of public safety that we can make as a state. So we've taken a hard look at how the school to prison pipeline, the neighborhood to prison pipeline is something that we talk about a lot in our office, which I think is starting to kind of usurp even in the school basis. So it's something that we talk about a lot. It doesn't really fit within the confines of our correctional education investment because we're at that point dealing with people who factually are justice involved. But the stats, bear out well that, traditional education completion is one of the best preventers of justice system contact you can have. So it's certainly something that we continue
I'd like
to
to
lean
add
into.
to that. Arti made a really good point earlier about majority of the time when we encounter someone incarcerated, the system has failed them multiple times. And so one of the things I learned when I was in prison, I went in at 17. There was a lot of young people in my therapy group. And, people who grew up in foster care, who was bullied in school and abused. And I started to think about how many times has the system failed our young people before they ended up in these prisons and being called monsters. And I also learned something else that's important too, is that often, what we do know that hurt people. So these young people were being hurt and abused for most of their lives, and then they end up in prison. We have to address younger people, or we have to be preemptive in our strategies with young people.
Absolutely.
I think that speaks to, and something I've just been noodling in my head, have done nothing about, so I'll start with that, is that I think there's a lot of mental health supports that need to be added into the K-12 system. And maybe Tennessee is looking at that, I don't know, but I think that's something we smart, forward-thinking states need to start thinking about.
And I guess to that point, there is a lot of work and opportunity there in the juvenile justice system. In Tennessee, that's via the Department of Children's Services, but we've done quite a bit of work. Former Governor Haslam really started it in 2018 with a kind of a landmark rewrite of the juvenile justice parts of the code, and we've kind of continued on that, is really holding the line on smart policy as it pertains to really high risk and vulnerable youth, and making sure that you're not kind of doing the whole lock them up and throw away the key thing because it's the easiest, most convenient thing to do. Because once you do that, you can never undo that. And the cost to that is of so much greater consequence than the convenience. And I think that that's something that it's hard. That's one of those things where we kind of talk about, like, what's the role of government and what's the role of state? We cannot control the culture around youth engagement and investing in communities and willingness of communities to kind of wrap their arms around their orneriest of youth. But someone needs to do that. And it's something that I think the more that we can kind of demonstrate what works and what the cost is, and really trying to be a standard bearer for really good, smart, forward-thinking public policy, that's what we can do. But it's absolutely something that needs. There will never be too much opportunity to invest in our youth and prevent them from ending up being the topic of this conversation. I mean, there's too much work to be done there.
And thinking through some of those like policy and funding levers, I saw a question from the audience around Second Chance Pell and kind of how do we ensure that people can actually access this funding? Are there any like levers of change that come to mind?
I'll let Arti speak more to this.
I see Arti smiling.
We actually don't use Second Chance Pell in Tennessee because we don't charge tuition. And we worked with the federal delegation when they were working on passing it and had lots of back and forth about the system that we had designed and how it could or couldn't work. And we've just collectively made a decision as a state that the kind of administrative barrier there outweighed the benefit for us. So we as a state save money by not using it. We do have nonprofit partners that have kind of engaged the post-secondary space beyond what the state covers. Those are elective college programs that are available because we certainly don't want to keep opportunity out. And they are using Second Chance Pell, but the feedback that we're getting is it's harder than people expected it to be. So I do think that there's still work to be done there. So I don't know what you...
Well, I would just to emphasize something you said, I don't know if it was clear to the audience, but Tennessee pays for the first 2 years of college for anyone who's incarcerated.
We do that for everybody anyway. We
Well,
just don't
okay.
not do it
So
for
sorry,
incarcerated.
they do it for everybody who's eligible. That is huge. I mean, that is the key to change, right? That alone. I don't know any other state, and maybe you do, that does it that way.
I don't know anybody that's done our funding model, but we do have, a lot of states have 2 years of college for high school graduates, like those sorts of scholarship models. We just made a decision that we're not going to not do that for incarcerated learners because they probably need it the most. So our funding model is very different. We fund the faculty, so we just hire college professors as if they are teaching in a free world campus and their classroom happens to be a prison campus. We don't treat them any differently. They're not TDOC employees. They're on the institution's payroll. It's exactly the same. So it's very, very different in its style. We also don't care if you're serving a life sentence. We don't exclude people for drug offenses. There's no carve-outs the way some of the other federal programs have. And for us, it was just a smarter thing to do.
I mean, so smart. I can't even begin to tell. Like, that's what's going to change our correctional systems. Because once you know there's a pathway from your high school equivalency to college, you earn more, you have more access to jobs. I mean, the virtuous cycle goes on. And that's what we need to do in this country.
Absolutely.
I agree.
I want to fit in one last question from the audience before we turn to kind of final closing thoughts. And I think this is probably a good one to end on, thinking on almost like the reentry side and kind of what happens after folks are released. The question is, do you know of good examples of programs that are working in concert with departments of correction to continue learning when people are released?
So the smart correctional systems, I'll give DC as an example in the jail, which for those of you who don't know, jails have a very hard time delivering programs because of the short length of stay and then the fact that they don't have staff to deliver those programs. But DC is unique because they have a program called Lead Up, which you start while you're incarcerated and then lead out so that you have additional supports when you're released. And those types of programs where you actually are continuing your education post-release, or in some cases even work-learn type programs, are super duper successful and give people, because I think Chris mentioned this earlier too, is like when you leave incarceration, the way you're not coming back is you're having a living wage job, a bank account, and a place to live. Those three things alone create a circumstance that will allow you not to go back in. Whatever states and counties can do to support those is really what's going to keep our correctional system working. And then associate's degree programs like what Tennessee's talking about, I can't emphasize those enough.
We staffed up to kind of do warm handoffs. So we've got reentry navigators that are part of our kind of post-secondary landscape that help navigate that reentry continuum. Our partnerships, I would encourage everyone to look at their departments of labor and workforce development, which are, I think, probably extraordinarily underutilized everywhere, but have a great capacity to bring to bear even with federal funding on the reentry space. But I think it's just making sure that you're doing a really good landscape analysis and figuring out what already exists and that you can kind of leverage and utilize. But there's, I think, a great degree of opportunity to partner with nonprofits and reentry organizations, but then also kind of state solutions to just make sure that you're using what you've already got.
I think we can probably end on final thoughts. There's one that I think we can kind of incorporate into final thoughts if there's anything else you all want to share. And then if there are any like outcome results that you guys are particularly proud of, I think that would be a nice note to end on into something that one of our audience members is wondering.
I mean, I'll start. I think for me, true success looks like moving from a correctional system of warehousing to one of true rehabilitation. And the fact that we can point to folks using our solution as having 20% more likely, 40, 60% more likely to achieve a job, a living wage job post-release, that makes me super proud.
To add to that, I think it's really important for us to remember that education is critical in keeping people home and allowing people to develop agency over themselves, to reacclimate into society. I've met so many people who really want to turn their lives around, and the way the system is set up is so difficult to just earn a livable wage or just acclimate back into society. And I think we should invest in that. That's important for all of us.
And I'll just share, I mean, there's a lot of outcomes that we could share and hopefully many more to come, but I think the thing that gave me all the food in my heart that I needed is I had an individual who had completed his college degree on the inside and was able to share at his graduation that he was the first person in his family to graduate from college. And he has children, and he was so proud of the impact and the role model. He said, when I've been probably the worst dad possible, at least I've done this thing right for them. And that, to me, is more than enough to keep going.
Absolutely. I think that's a very hopeful and powerful note to end on. I just want to say thank you to everyone for the amazing questions from the audience. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Would love to hear a round of applause for Chris, Arti, and Abigale.